SEP FanFic Readings presents The Watergaw by smokybaltic and ectoheart. Chapter 5. Hermione's breakdown, while humiliating, had been cathartic, which was fortunate because she now had a whole new bag of issues to deal with. Or not. Yes, Draco had held her hand, been sympathetic, perhaps, almost like a friend, but that didn't need to mean anything. This was all lost time, she decided. Anything they did here would be considered to have been done under duress, surely. Her friends didn't need to know. No one ever needed to know. But she knew. As they set out for the day, she found herself glancing sideways at him as they strode through the mossy groves. Once more she found questions were burgeoning, tickling her tongue, begging to burst free. She had wanted information from him before. Now she wanted information about him. On reflection, he had been strangely placid over the last several days. He still complained, certainly he still complained, but it was about the mundanities, not the greater evils. He still seemed to find some delight in riling her up, but it didn't seem malicious. When he had let the hinky-punk incident rest, burying it under hours of dispassionate courtesy, she had been enraged. When he had said nothing of the previous night's breakdown, burying it beneath speculation about whether alchemy was more philosophy or science, she found she was grateful. And curious. There was a certain liberty that came with being in the middle of nowhere, with speaking so often in the dark. She found herself being more speculative, more frank, more inclined to follow her whims. Draco didn't know her, not really. Whatever he thought of her was presumably horrid, so she couldn't be bothered to worry about his opinion. With her friends and family, she was the swot, the bookworm, the responsible one. That's what they were expecting her to be, needed her to be. Without them around, she could be anything. She wondered if it were the same for Draco. Was this version of him what he always was to his, she hesitated, his non-enemies? Or was this something else altogether? The pieces of information she had didn't fit anymore. He couldn't possibly form a cohesive whole from the scraps she'd gathered. If they found their way out of this debacle today, she knew she'd be haunted by the gaps. The thought of which led her eventually to ask, of all things, "How do you know about Narnia?" He raised a pale eyebrow. "You mentioned Narnia the other day. Why do you know what that is?" "You really need to trade up on Potter and the Weasel. Basic literacy should not come as such a surprise." "Says the best mate of Crabbe and Goyle." Draco shrugged carelessly, hands in his pockets. "So?" she persisted. "Why have you read C.S. Lewis? A Muggle author. You've mentioned others, too." "I read everything. The origin of literature isn't something purebloods bother much about." Up was down, left was right. Draco Malfoy read Muggle books. "I've never seen a pureblood reading a Muggle book," she said skeptically. "That's because the only purebloods you spend time with are the Weasleys. I'm guessing you haven't seen them read much of anything." "Hey!" she protested. "Tell me I'm wrong." "Well, it's not like I've shared a dorm with any of— Oh, you're just trying to distract me." She gave him a shove, setting him off balance for a step or two. "You're seriously saying Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy were fine with their son reading Muggle books?" Draco took a moment to weigh his answer. "Malfoys, as you may have noticed, have high standards. We are the most intelligent, the richest, the best-looking, the most cultured, the most powerful." He said it like he was laying out plain facts, without a hint of diffidence. "My mother's family felt blood alone was the important thing, but then they would, wouldn't they? The most ancient and noble house of Black. The Malfoys, however, insist on superiority in all things. My father ensured my education was not neglected." "Can it really be considered superiority when you play second to a mudblood in almost every subject?" She took no small measure of satisfaction in the rejoinder, even if she couldn't deliver it to Lucius himself. Her grades had only earned her an eye roll in Gryffindor Tower for years now. It was nice to have a chance to flex. "My father would certainly agree with you there." He gave a pained sort of smile. "Never a good day when I had to present him with the class rankings." He was quiet for a moment, before he said, somewhat bitterly, "Must have been nice for you." "It was," she said promptly. "I earned it." Draco scoffed. Okay. I did, in spite of Snape's best efforts. Yeah, not like any of the other professors or, the headmaster had an agenda. Excuse me? Oh, give it up. We both know when marks or house points came down to Muggle-born prodigy or chosen one versus affluent Death Eater spawn, that Dumbledore and McGonagall had the rest of them weren't exactly impartial. Hermione recoiled. I have never been given special treatment. Neither has Harry. Really? Hermione's mind flashed involuntarily to being given a time turner in third year, to winning the House Cup because of a last-minute influx in points, to 100 different knowing winks from Dumbledore. Maybe they had been treated differently, but that was only because they were different. Of course not, she sniffed, angrily tucking curls behind her ears. There were times when circumstances were rectified, but it was always in correction of an oversight, or because the situation was dire. It's true. I'm not saying you aren't clever. He might as well have slapped her, but it wasn't a fair fight. Will NEWTs be fair enough fight for you? She snapped back in challenge. He barked a laugh. Aren't you the optimist? Okay, yes. If somehow we both get to write our NEWTs, then you're on. Winner takes all. He raised an eyebrow and stuck out his hand. It was dry and a bit rough, dwarfing hers as she took it in a firm shake. This is going to be so embarrassing for you, she said smugly. He only looked amused. I hope you'll be braced for impact, because it's going to be a long fall off that high horse. In the course of their conversation, they'd walked down into a fecund-looking valley, damp and softly green with smatterings of small flowers throughout. Hermione was beginning to be in hopes of finding a stream, and her eyes were roving hungrily over the ground for a hint of it, when a rumbling drew her up short. She motioned for Draco to stop as well. Deer, she whispered. A herd of deer. The thundering got louder, and as the great animals emerged from the trees, the beating of their hooves reverberated through the soil. There were at least 24 of them, enormous, cantering down through the low of the valley before disappearing back into the forest, just passing through. Their tawny coats were patchy with thick tufts of grayish-brown fur that stuck out in odd directions, ready to fall away with the last of the winter chill. Hermione and Draco stood silently, watching, until Hermione was suddenly gripped by a horrible realization. Red deer! She looked around wildly to the branches of the trees overhead until she saw it. She knew she had. A reddish squirrel with tufted ears. Bloody fucking son of a cocksucker bitch damn hell motherfucker! She cursed loudly and fluently, thoroughly dispelling the idyllic atmosphere. He looked at her alarmed. We're in Scotland! She buried her hands in her curls in frustration, tugging at the roots. Probably northern Scotland. We could not be further from where we need to be. Fuck! You know this because... The deer, the squirrels, the bloody hinky-punk. She gestured emphatically. I should have realized, with the terrain and everything, but I never thought we could have gotten so far. Scotland! We can't go to Hogwarts, Draco said immediately. We can't? Absolutely not. Security will be tighter there than anywhere, and the Carrows hate blood traitors worse than Muggles. Is there anything else? Anyone? A town? Something you know of? Hermione's mind was already combing through everything she knew of Wizarding Scotland. This was not good news, but at least she finally had something that felt like solid information. She had heard of a small magical shopping district in Edinburgh, but not knowing anything about how to access it, that knowledge was essentially useless. Hogsmeade had mostly been boarded up, even before she'd gone on the run. McGonagall's home was probably under a Fidelius charm. Draco just shook his head. She peppered him with questions as they carried on walking, sussing out all the potential avenues for getting a wand or infiltrating Hogwarts. Even internally, as she was considering bus routes and how far she could get on the little stash of pounds sterling she had in her bag. Until now, she'd been operating under the assumption they wouldn't be much more than a county away from Wiltshire, Wales at worst. In which case, she could have easily headed for the Borough, or London, and directed Draco off through Muggle channels to wherever he decided to go. France seemed sensible to her, but he remained contrarian whenever the subject arose, and honestly, it hadn't much mattered to her. She'd give him what advice she could, and they'd be going their separate ways. It wasn't her concern. Now, however, it seemed their paths might lie along the same road for longer than she'd anticipated. Bloody Scotland! It defied reason. There would definitely be books on apparition that would be investigated on that far off someday, when recreational research was once again a viable option. At least one thing was now clear. Going south would be their objective. There was a simmering, impotent outrage at finding they were in such a ridiculous location, but the certainty of it was soothing nonetheless. This was data, solid information that she could reference against her stores of knowledge in the hopes of generating solutions. They made camp for the night, not long after when they finally found a broad, clear stream. Hermione was desperate enough to try to wash her hair in spite of the late hour, braiding it into 2 thick plaits afterwards that hung heavy over her shoulders. She was chilled but blessedly refreshed. The site also yielded enough dry wood for a large fire and plush grass that made for relatively comfortable bedding. As they sat by the fire, warming tins of stew and tea, perched on a log with the hoods of their sweaters up and blankets spread over their laps, she could almost have imagined they were camping on purpose. When they settled down to sleep, Hermione's eyes fluttered shut on the sight of the starry sky dappled with clouds through the branches overhead. A Scottish sky. She thought it looked quite beautiful. The next day, they set off south. At least, Hermione hoped it was south. She'd never been good at gauging direction based on the stars or the sun, and Draco's opinion seemed more a matter of confidence than real proficiency. In either event, they couldn't do much worse than they had been. By mid-morning, they were out of the woods again and back to the grassy hills. She wasn't sure at what point the hill could be classified as a mountain, but she guessed the Scots must, out of necessity, have some extensive terminology to clarify the point. Truthfully, Hermione had stopped thinking of this as one long journey, and thought more now of making it to the next resting place, the next opportune spot to freshen up, or gain a better view, or camp. She wasn't even considering the possibility that they would find anything remotely helpful today. So it was with that grim determination she faced the expanse of wild and unspoiled majesty that was the hills and mountains of Scottish Highlands, spread out before her now with the trappings of all their romantic history intact. By God, she'd had enough of sweeping vistas and rugged natural beauty to last a lifetime. Draco, on the other hand, seemed to be almost relishing the view, the flora, the fresh air. When they weren't talking, it was as if his mind were drifting a million miles away, a strangely peaceful look on his eyes and a softness in his angular face. They were even brief bouts of whistling. It was starting to piss her off. A lazy, careless expression would have seemed de rigueur for the Malfoy heir, but this was more like a contemplative serenity. He was living Walden, while she was finding a new depth of understanding for Call of the Wild. As he blithely took a steep bit of the hill in a couple long strides and reached back to offer her a hand up, she had to say something. "You're so pensive." "Well," he said slowly, "I wouldn't mind running some Quidditch drills or reading a good book, but unfortunately my options are rather limited at the moment, so thinking it is." She released his hand and dusted off the knee of her jeans that had grazed the dirt. "Must you always snark?" "Yes, I'm like a snark shark. If I stop, I'll die," he deadpanned. "You might want to give that a go, then, because I promise you it'll be less painful than what I'm going to do to you if you keep it up." "Has anyone ever told you you've got anger issues?" "I don't have anger issues. I have Malfoy issues." "I inspire passion. What can I say?" "You inspire homicide." Draco smiled broadly down at her. "Oh, when she is angry, she is keen and shrewd. She was a vixen when she went to school, and though she be but little, she is fierce." That's right there," she jabbed a finger at him. "Quoting Shakespeare, and being in ambient with nature and all that. What is that?" "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." She studied him earnestly, like he might give it away with a look or a gesture. "You're philosophic, relaxed. It's weird." "I really don't know what you mean." "Just get on with it, would you? You know I'll only keep on if you don't." "Honestly?" He looked rueful, taking his time to answer. "I've got nothing else to lose. This is the worst-case scenario. I'm a dead man. Once you've stepped off the ledge, you might as well enjoy the feel of the wind on your face." She stared at him until he awkwardly lifted a shoulder and looked away. Is that what you think you've done? She asked uncertainly. I'm not stupid. Once I'm back to civilization, there's nowhere that'll be safe. If your lot doesn't get me, mine will. I jumped, and I know the impact's coming, but this... He waved a vague hand. This is the fall. Hermione bit her lip. She lifted her bag over her head so it hung off her opposite shoulder. She unplaited her hair and wrangled it back into a bun. She tried, in short, to fidget away her discomfort. It didn't work. Her mind was already off and running, chasing down probabilities and churning up more questions. Your parents? She tried. Not sure I have those anymore. You heard my father when he wanted me to identify you and the others. Capturing Potter was meant to fix everything. Instead, he'll know we had you and let you escape. If my parents are still alive, it's a safe bet I've been disowned. She certainly couldn't say she was sorry, even if that was feeling of discomfort bore down a little harder. Not to him, not about this. Instead, she took herself by surprise when she admitted quietly, I don't have my parents anymore either. What? Draco grabbed her arm and stopped her walking, his gray eyes wide with alarm. Are they... No, she assured him with a tight smile. They're alive, but I needed to keep them safe, so I obliviated them. They don't know they have a daughter anymore. Shit. They started walking again, and Hermione found that now she'd broached the subject, she couldn't let it rest. I told my friends that it was reversible, but I don't think it is. I had to take too much. There was just so many memories, and they were so deeply rooted. It wasn't a proper use of a memory charm, really. He seemed to think it over for a minute before asking, Did you have to introduce false memories as well? Yeah. Shit. I know. She did know. It was a bad combination. The false memories would be getting better incorporated by the day. They would be forming the foundation for new memories. Ripping them away and trying to reintroduce old memories would be extremely risky. Probably too risky. But that was a problem she refused to broach until there was something she could do about it. Anyway, she continued, they're safe. They were quiet for a few minutes before Draco said wryly, This is going really well, isn't it? Just all around. Hermione laughed so hard she had to stop and bend over to put her hands on her knees. Fuck, she shook her head. Obviously, yes, for everybody. Their conversation moved back to less fraught territory after that, but an uneasy silence settled between them as the light began to fade. Hermione's feet and calves were aching thanks to the endless hills they'd been walking, but she was pushing the pace now. It had been nothing but grassy hills for hours, and there was nothing but grassy hills in sight. There was no need to discuss the glaringly obvious. There was no prospect for shelter, or even kindling for fire. Thankfully, it didn't look like rain, but it was windy enough to significantly worsen the night chill. She was reasonably certain their magic would prevent them from dying of exposure if it came to it, but that didn't mean a night out in the cold would be anything like pleasant. Finally, their progress was arrested by the intensifying darkness. With clouds obscuring the moon and stars, it would soon be pitch black. They settled into a shallow valley, and Hermione began fishing supplies out of her bag, more by feel than sight. Blankets, every article of clothing they had, a sleeve of crackers, and a tin of what unfortunately turned out to be peas. Perhaps it was the nervous anticipation of the frigid night that lay ahead, or perhaps it was the illusion of existing in a vacuum that the complete darkness lent, but they laughed to the point of hysteria over everything and nothing. The struggling into ridiculous layers, their ill-fated attempts to ferry peas from tin to mouth, their absurd suggestions and terrible puns. You know what would help? Draco prodded. What's that? Wine. Hermione snorted. Alcohol is a vasodilator. You feel warm, but it actually makes you more susceptible to the cold. Come on, Granger. Let's live dangerously. She burst out laughing. Because we're not getting enough of that already. Exactly. It would rate like a 2 on our danger scale, relatively speaking. God, you'd make a great lawyer. A what? A muggle who argues for money. That's a job? He marveled. Merlin, I've got these muggles all wrong. That's fantastic. She face-palmed, because of course. I mean, they're considered pretty slimy, but most people think they're just out for the money. Think of the damage that would do to my reputation. Draco was cracking up. To the prestige of the Malfoy name. Hermione lost it, barely managing to choke out, I would lose all respect for you. How would I ever cope? They dissolved into helpless laughter, until Hermione, finally calming, lamented. Fuck me, it's getting cold. Where are you? Here. A moment later, she felt the tentative brush of his hand on her ankle, and since she was sitting cross-legged, that was immediately followed by the brush of his hand between her thighs. Whoa! She grabbed his wrist. You found me. That's close enough. Granger. His voice was very near. I'd be willing to share my blanket. Perfect lawyer, she muttered. Is that your way of asking to share my blanket? It's bloody freezing. Fine. She could press for him to make a proper request, but really, what was the point? He was beyond help. Granger, could you let go of my arm? She dropped it like she'd been scalded, and in the absence of visual scrutiny, gave the full-body cringe that her mortification demanded. Okay, I'll just... After awkwardly knocking heads, elbows, and knees, they eventually managed to arrange themselves side by side with the blankets layered and equitably spread. Hermione stuffed her hair down the back of her jumper, pulled up the hood before tucking her hands into her sleeves and laying on her side with her back to Draco. Could be worse, he said after a minute. We could be in one of Bin's Goblin War lectures. She chuckled. Detention in the Forbidden Forest. Bottom of the Black Lake in February. Honestly, that wasn't as bad as a Quidditch match in January. Oi, he protested. You should be so lucky. Pfft. There's no greater proof of my selfless love for my friends than the fact that I subject myself to those. And please bear in mind, I have risked literal death for Harry. Oh, come now, Granger. There's no one else for Miles. Just us. You could admit you like it. She feigned serious contemplation. Well, I do seem to recall a match where Fred really nailed the smarmy little Slytherin seeker with a bludger. Gryffindor must have won by, 200 points. Hey, that hit dislocated my shoulder, by the way. Merlin, you're bloodthirsty. And it was a 100-point win. Hermione chuckled. Oh, my mistake. Big difference, that. It is. They lapsed into silence, the blankets stretched taut between them as they both tried to wrap themselves tighter. Hermione was pretty sure her eyes were closed, but it was difficult to tell. There was nothing she wanted more now than to just fall asleep and wake up to a warm, sunny morning. Draco was drawing shuddering little breaths, trembling just the same as she was, shifting to try to find a better position. She was just about to tell him to stop fidgeting when he heaved a dramatic sigh. Fuck it, he muttered before he rolled over and in one fluid motion wedged one arm under her head and wrapped his other arm around her middle, pulling her flush to him. His broader frame fairly enveloped her. Malfoy! She squeaked, instinctively trying to squirm away. It's bloody cold. His breath was warm against her ear, and she shivered involuntarily. He tightened his hold, curling around her so his hips were pressed right up against her arse and their legs were tangled. This is warmer. Yeah, but... The sooner you stop talking, the sooner we can be unconscious. She really couldn't argue with his logic. Desperate times and all that. Still, it took a few minutes before the tension left her body, and she finally gave up on holding her arm awkwardly above her head and let it rest alongside his, draped over her stomach. It was disturbingly comforting. There had been numerous times over the years when she would mentally flash forward to having to one day describe her present situation to a therapist, obliviating her parents, polyjuicing herself into a cat, polyjuicing herself into her male best friend, Harry's many near brushes with death, Ron's abandonment. It was getting to be a long list, she thought vaguely as she drifted off to sleep. But cuddling with her childhood bully was definitely going to merit a session or two.